Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we really get into some dense texts, some challenging ideas, and try to, pull out the key insights for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and today we're tackling Jacques Lacan, specifically his monumental Écrits. And look, we know Lacan can be, well, intimidating, but our mission today is to kind of guide you through it. This isn't just some dry academic exercise. It's really about digging into these profound ideas that honestly can reshape how you think about yourself, about language, your place in the world. We're going to try and unearth those core philosophical threads, see how they weave together into this often surprising picture of what it means to be human. It's kind of a shortcut to getting really well informed on some seriously influential thinking.
Oh, absolutely. The Écrits, they are famously tricky, no doubt.
Yeah.
But the insights you get into the human subject are just unparalleled. Today, we'll really focus on the big themes, the philosophical arguments. We're exploring these deep structures that, Lacan says define our very being. It's like a journey into the mind's architecture, really. And he was so insistent on precision, on going back to Freud's original, often radical ideas. We want to go beyond just scratching the surface, really grasp the depth of Lacan's contribution.
Okay, so let's dive in and unpack this fascinating material. We'll make sure to pull out the crucial takeaways and, connect them back to what it means for you, the listener.
The constitutive power of the symbolic order.
All right, let's jump right in with maybe the cornerstone, this foundational and frankly pretty revolutionary idea from Lacan, the constitutive power of the symbolic order. This is where he really flips things, doesn't he? Turns psychology on its head. 1.1, the subject and the signifier, a radical reversal.
He really does.
Yeah.
The core idea is, well, it's profound. Lacan argues that it is the symbolic order which is constitutive for the subject, not the other way around. That's a huge departure. Usually we think of ourselves as, individuals first, and then we sort of go out and use language, make meaning. Lacan suggests it's almost the reverse.
So wait, you're saying instead of us creating language and culture, it's language and culture that actually create us as subjects. And that sounds like we're born into this big system that shapes who we even are.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Think of the symbolic order as this vast pre-existing network. It's language, cultural norms, laws, social structures, traditions, all of it. It's already there when we arrive. We don't invent it. It's the environment we're immersed in. And it's within that framework that we get a sense of self, a place, our ability to think and speak. So our identity, it's less about some inner core and more about where we're positioned within this whole linguistic and cultural matrix, how we're spoken about, how we speak.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Because Lacan doesn't just leave this as an abstract theory. He uses Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Purloined Letter, to show it in action. It seems like just a mystery story, but for Lacan, it demonstrates what he calls the major determination the subject receives from the itinerary of a signifier.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how Poe sets it up. The letter itself, Lacan calls it a pure signifier. Its actual content. Well, some characters know it, but we, the readers, don't initially. And for a lot of the plot, the meaning is less important than its circulation, its position, just its presence, where it is, who has it, that actively determines what the characters do, their roles, even their inner states. The queen, the minister, Dupin.
So the letter's not just a thing, it's like a force that dictates their reality.
Precisely. Take the minister. His whole power, his social standing, it all hinges on having that letter. Even if he doesn't fully grasp its use beyond leverage, his inability to just get rid of it shows he doesn't know what else to do with the letter. He's totally dependent on it, just as a signifier. His position, his power, is literally defined by his relationship to this circulating thing. He's caught by it.
Right. And then Dupin, the detective, his clever move snatching the original and putting a fake one there that really hits the point home, doesn't it? It shows the physical letter, the paper and ink, is less important than its function as a signifier, what it represents, how it works in the system. The fact that a copy works just as well, that shows the power isn't in the object itself.
Absolutely. And this is key to Lacan's reading. Poe deliberately structures the story, gets rid of the usual crime stuff, motive, weapon, evidence right at the start of each section. That's not just clever writing. It pushes our focus away from individual psychology, why they did it, and onto the symbolic path of the letter itself. Dupin's trick, like turning cards face up, isn't just about revealing a secret. It's about performing it anew in a purer form. It demonstrates the supremacy of the signifier in the subject. It shows how our subjective positions aren't fixed. They're dynamic, determined by where we stand in relation to these signifiers.
Wow. So it's a big leap then to think the same dynamic applies Well, everywhere, even in therapy, where words and hidden meanings are flying around. How does Lacan take this to the psychoanalyst's role?
That's a crucial connection he makes. He suggests analysts are also caught up in this. They act as emissaries of all the purloined letters, which, at least for a while, remain en souffrance with us in the transference. Meaning patients bring these symbolic letters, these unacknowledged, circulating, powerful signifiers into the analysis. And handling that carries a huge responsibility. A responsibility, he warns, you shouldn't just neutralize by equating it with the signifier that most thoroughly annihilates every signification, namely money. It's a sharp warning against reducing analysis to just a transaction.
Okay, so this powerful idea, the signifier's primacy, shaping reality, shaping us, it feeds directly into how we understand language itself. It's not just a communication tool. It's like a fundamental force. 1.2 language as destiny, law, and structure.
Exactly. Lacan has that famous line, language hands down its sentence to those who know how to hear it. It's not just about conveying meaning. It's about how the very structures of language profoundly shape our experience, our reality, our destiny even. It's this subtle, pervasive influence, like a hidden code running underneath everything.
And he even points to tiny linguistic details to show this, like the partitive particle. What's that about?
Yeah, think about how we use articles, like of, or some, or any. Phrases like, this discourse full of meaning, or some intentionality, or no longer any love. Lacan notices how spirit, if spirit be living signification, seems to allow for quantification more than the letter does. Even abstract things like meaning, intention, love, hate language lets us talk about them in quantities, as if they're divisible chunks. It shows how language structures, even limits, how we grasp our most intimate inner experiences. It's the lens.
That still sounds a bit abstract, but Lacan gives a concrete example, right, to show how even random stuff reveals these deep symbolic structures, like finding a pattern in chaos.
He does. Uses coin tosses. You'd think that's pure chance, right?
Yeah.
But Lacan shows how even reality strictly distributed by chance can accommodate strictest symbolic determinations. He does it by symbolizing groups of 3 coin tosses.
How does that work? Finding order in randomness.
Well, imagine you note down sequences of 3 tosses. Say 3 heads plus plus plus, or 3 tails is 1. Alternating ones like plus plus or fee plus, which is 3 things. And the mixed ones plus 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 and plus grade are 2. If you then make a new series just using these numbers, the 1-3 network, he calls it suddenly, patterns emerge. Possibilities and impossibilities of succession appear in this new symbolic chain.
So just by recoding random events into symbols, a new law shows up where there was only chance before. Like imposing a language onto chaos reveals a hidden order.
Exactly. This network, he says, reveals the concentric symmetry implicit in the triad. And the really profound implication, it demonstrates the essential link between memory and law, right from the start, from the primordial symbol's first composition with itself, end quote. And this link is reciprocal and retroactive. Later terms can determine earlier ones in the chain. It suggests that, at the outset, subjectivity has no relation to the real, but rather to a syntax which is engendered by the signifying mark there. Our experience of reality is mediated, maybe even constructed, by these symbolic rules, this hidden grammar, before we even think about it.
Okay, so what does this mean for us day to day? It means our world isn't just random events. There are deep, hidden structural laws everywhere, even in chance. And these laws are tied to how symbols interact and make meaning. They shape us in ways we don't even realize, like finding a secret code in coin flips.
And this leads directly to how Lacan sees psychoanalysis itself. Not just observing psychology, but as a rigorous science rooted in these symbolic structures and their laws. 1.3 Psychoanalysis and the Science of the Signifier. Lacan argues that Freud's idea of signifying overdetermination, how multiple symbolic meanings pile up in dreams or symptoms, has to be understood within a framework where the autonomy of the symbolic is key. This is totally different from seeing it as real overdetermination, which he kind of dismisses as a conceptual aberration people use to calm their religious excitations. For Lacan, the symbolic realm language, it has its own logic, its own consistency. It's not just reflecting some deeper reality. It has its own power.
And rethinking it this way clarifies core analytic practices, right? Like free association, that thing where patients just say whatever comes to mind.
Exactly. Asserting the symbolic's autonomy is the only way, he thinks, to truly clarify the theory and practice of free association. It links it to symbolic determination and to its laws, not to some vague imaginary inertia or psychologizing confusion. It means the patient's random-seeming thoughts aren't just random. They're governed by hidden symbolic connections, linguistic rules that the analyst needs to hear. It's the unconscious speaking its own language. So we're not just using language, we're fundamentally caught in it. Our being is defined by it. The symbolic order is almost like our primary reality. Precisely. Lacan puts it starkly. If man comes to think about the symbolic order, it is because he is first caught in it in his being. The common idea that we consciously form language or culture, that comes from a specific gap in his imaginary relationship with his symbol. That gap lets us enter the symbolic order as a subject through the radical defile of speech. It's through language we become subjects, enter the human world. But in doing so, we're already subject to his laws.
And understanding this, I guess, really recasts Freud. Makes him seem much more radical, more focused on structure than maybe some later interpretations allowed.
Definitely. Lacan really emphasizes how Freud's thinking was incredibly structuralist, way ahead of its time in seeing the power of language. The interpretation of dreams, he says, paved the way for formal linguistics. Its weight of its truth showed the constitutive role of the signifier long before linguistics caught up. Freud basically intuited the linguistic structure of the unconscious, which then leads us to a really big question. If our being is caught in language, if the symbolic order shapes us, what does that mean for our sense of self? What about the ego, the I we think we know so well?
The elusive nature of the ego and identification.
That's a great question because, when we talk about the ego, usually we mean our conscious self, our identity, that kind of stable core me. But Lacan, like you said, paints a much more complicated picture, maybe even unsettling. It's not the solid captain of the ship we imagine. 2.1, the ego as an imaginary construct, opaque to reflection.
Absolutely. Lacan defines the ego not as stable core, but as this dynamic, often illusory thing. He describes it as, one, the nucleus given to consciousness, though it is opaque to reflection, that is marked by all the ambiguities which, from self-indulgence to bad faith, structure the human subject's lived experience of the passions. And two, the I, that opposes its irreducible inertia of pretenses and misrecognition to the concrete problematic of the subject's realization.
Whoa, okay, that's a mouthful. Opaque to reflection, does that mean we can't actually see or know our own ego clearly?
Pretty much, yeah. It means the ego, even though it feels like our core, is fundamentally clouded. It's wrapped in illusions, misrecognitions. It's not transparent or self-knowing. Think of it like a funhouse mirror. You see an image, you recognize it as you, but it's always distorted, exaggerated, fragmented somehow. This image, this ego, is constantly puffing itself up, full of pretenses, resisting anything that challenges its perceived stability.
And it sounds like this ego is also tied up with frustration. Like it's designed to leave us feeling unsatisfied.
Deeply. Lacan says the ego is frustration in its very essence. Not just frustration of a specific desire, but frustration of an object in which his desire is alienated. The more we invest our sense of self, our identity, in external images, roles, goals, the more developed this alienated object becomes, the more profoundly the subject becomes alienated from his jouissance.
Jouissance.
All right.
That's one of those key Lacanian terms. It's not just enjoyment, is it? It's something more intense.
It is, yeah. Jouissance is more than just pleasure.
Yeah.
It's often this intense, excessive satisfaction that can even be uncomfortable, painful, transgressive. It's that thing we might pursue even when it's not good for us because it touches something fundamental, often beyond simple pleasure. So if your desire is alienated, chasing some external image, you get cut off from this deeper, fundamental jouissance. It's a cycle. Seeking satisfaction outside only distances you further from your own, often paradoxical enjoyment.
Okay, this sounds like a really tricky thing for analysis to deal with then. How do you even approach something so elusive, so frustrating, so opaque?
Well, analytic work, what Lacan calls the analytic meutic, it doesn't attack the ego directly. It takes a detour. It aims, he says, to inducing in the subject a guided paranoia. Now, that sounds alarming, but it's not about creating psychosis. It's about bringing out the projection of what Melanie Klein calls bad internal objects. It's a way to systematically reveal the paranoid mechanisms, the defenses that structure the ego. The goal isn't to strengthen this illusory ego, but to kind of dismantle its defenses, reveal the dynamics of how it formed and what imaginary stuff keeps it going. It really highlights how the ego isn't this stable core, but it's dynamic, constantly reforming, heavily influenced by images and relationships. This progressive alienation and self-consciousness, seeing yourself through an external image then feeling estranged from it. It actually connects to Hegel's phenomenology, that whole dialectic of self-realization through alienation. Seeing yourself in the other, but knowing that image isn't really you.
And that brings us to a really specific foundational moment in this whole process, the mirror stage. 2.2, the mirror stage, primordial identification. The mirror stage. That's probably one of Lacan's most famous ideas. But what exactly is it, and why is it so crucial for understanding this imaginary nature of the ego?
It's fascinating because it manifests the affective dynamism by which the subject primordially identifies with the visual gestalt of his own body. It's this key moment, usually in early infancy. The child, the little man at the infant stage, infants meaning not yet speaking, is still motorically pretty helpless, totally dependent.
Right, so before they can walk properly or coordinate well.
Exactly. And at this stage, the child sees its reflection maybe in a literal mirror, maybe just perceives its body as a whole through someone else's gaze, and jubilantly assumes this specular image. This image looks like an ideal unity, a salutary imago. It's a stark contrast to the child's own feeling of being uncoordinated, fragmented. The external image offers a sense of wholeness the child doesn't physically have yet, and its value is boosted by that early distress resulting from the child's intra-organic and relational discordance due to being born physiologically premature. This external image gives a premature but vital sense of a unified self, an I. What's really key here is that this identification with an external ideal image creates the I in a primordial form. This happens before it gets fully caught up in identifying with others, and before language fully gives it its function as a subject. It's this foundational moment where we get a sense of self and ego, often through this initial, powerful, and ultimately illusory external reflection. It's a misrecognition, really, because we identify with an image that isn't our full lived experience. And that misrecognition forms the core of the ego.
And it's not always a peaceful moment, right? It's also linked, surprisingly, to aggression.
That's a crucial insight. Lacan links this identification directly to aggression. He says, aggressiveness is the tendency correlated with a mode of identification I call narcissistic, which determines the formal structure of man's ego and of the register of entities characteristic of his world. Go. So the very formation of the ego, our sense of I, is tied to aggressive impulses, to our relationship with that idealized external image. The tension between the fragmented body and the unified image, that sets the stage for later aggression, often aimed at rivals for that ideal image, or anything that threatens its perceived wholeness.
So that first moment of getting an I is already tied up with tension, maybe even aggression. He kind of makes me think about how, even as adults, we compare ourselves to idealized images, like on social media, chasing a perfect reflection that leaves us feeling inadequate or defensive. Is that like a distant echo of this?
Absolutely. That's a perfect analogy. It shows how this fundamental dynamic, chasing an ideal image, an ego that's always a bit outside ourselves, keeps playing out, often leading to that feeling of lack or an aggressive defense of our image. And given this complex, fragile view of the ego, it makes sense that Lacan was pretty critical of where psychoanalysis was heading in his day. 2.3 Critique of the Autonomous Ego and Objectification.
Yeah, Lacan was deeply critical of trends he saw, especially this move towards an autonomous ego. He kind of lamented the reign of boredom he felt was partly due to this idea that the ego is the theology of free enterprise. This view treated the ego like this self-sufficient, rational thing that analysis should just strengthen and make independent. He saw that as a total betrayal of Freud's original, much more radical insights about the fractured subject.
And he felt even one of Freud's most famous phrases was being twisted to support this ego-strengthening idea he disagreed with. Exactly. That famous line, "Wo es war, soll ich werden," often translated as, where the id was, there the ego shall be. For Lacan, that translation and the interpretation that followed was a profound misdirection by many post-Freudians. He points out Freud wrote the ego and the id precisely to maintain the fundamental distinction between the true subject of the unconscious and the ego as constituted in its nucleus by a series of alienating identifications.
That's a really critical difference. So what's Lacan's reading of that line? The more faithful one, he'd argue.
He breaks down the German very carefully. Whoa! Where a specific place, a locus of being, es, the impersonal it or id, the subject without objectifying articles. War was a past state. Soll, shall or ought, a moral duty. Ich, I, the speaking subject, like it is I, and werden, become or be born from this place. For Lacan, it means I must come to be as a subject where it filled was. It's not about the ego taking over the id for conscious mastery. It's about a transformation rooted in the unconscious. It's about the subject emerging in its truth from that place of the unconscious, not strengthening the ego's false autonomy. It's about recognizing the unconscious forces, not the ego conquering them.
So a lot of analysts trying to maybe make Freud more palatable or practical ended up distorting him. advocating for something Freud didn't intend and Lacan saw as actively unhelpful.
Pretty much. Lacan points out that the theory of the end of analysis as identification with the analyst's ego is most opposed to the truth that analysis must bring out. And that truth is the foreignness of unconscious effects, which cut down to size the pretension to autonomy that the ego takes as its ideal. Identifying with the analyst's ego, that's a false resolution. The patient just adopts the analyst's ideals instead of confronting their own unconscious truth. It's like swapping one illusory master for another.
And this isn't just theory. It has real dangers in actual analytic practice.
Absolutely. The analyst who, by simply targeting the object whose image is the subject's ego, falls under the sway of the illusions of his own ego. That leads to distance in his object relation, not real analytic work. This objectifying orientation is the opposite of maintaining the analytic dialectic, where the aim is to unravel the subject's alienating identifications, not reinforce them. It risks turning the analysis into just another mirror stage, a mutual ego thing, instead of a space for radical self-discovery.
Okay, so if the ego is often this mirage, this imaginary construct, and the true subject lies elsewhere in the unconscious, in the symbolic order, how do we actually get to it?
Yeah.
It feels like speech has to be the way in, the very fabric where these hidden truths show up.
Speech, desire, and the unconscious.
Right. So if the ego is this tricky imaginary thing caught in reflections, and the real subject is rooted somewhere deeper in the symbolic, in the unconscious, how do we actually access that? You just mentioned speech might be the key. Let's get into that, because it sounds like for Lacan, language isn't just communication, it's almost alive. 3.1 speech as a subtle body and a constitutive act.
Absolutely central, yeah. And Lacan's take on it is quite radical. He insists speech is in fact a gift of language, and language is not immaterial. It is a subtle body, but body is. That's a crucial point. We often think of words as just abstract ideas floating around, but Lacan says they have a material force, a kind of bodily dimension. Words are caught up in all the body images that captivate the subject. They can express deep psychic realities, sometimes in really visceral ways. He gives examples like knock up the hysteric, or the urinary flow of urethral ambition, or feces retained in avaricious jouissance. These aren't just crude phrases. They show how language isn't just describing a body. It's deeply woven into bodily experience and its symbolic meaning. Words carry immense psychological weight.
So speaking isn't just passing information along, it's an act in itself, with real effects for the speaker and the listener.
Exactly. Speech is an act. It presupposes a subject and establishes himself here by being the other, but in a paradoxical unity of the one and the other. When we speak, we're always already in a relationship with another, even if that other is internalized, imagined, or the big other of culture and norms. The act of speaking itself positions us in this field of intersubjectivity, creating and reinforcing our place relative to others.
Wow. That sounds incredibly complex for an analyst to navigate. How does an analyst even begin to hear this subtle body of speech beyond just the literal meaning of the words?
Well, the analyst's presence creates this unique situation where language, prior to signifying something, signifies to someone. The analyst has to learn to suspend their immediate urge to respond to the surface content. They need to listen for the deeper intention hidden in the patient's discourse. Is it demanding, punitive, trying to appease, demonstrative, aggressive? That reveals the tension in the patient's psychic and social world. The analyst listens for who the language is signifying to and what hidden desires or conflicts are being played out, even unconsciously.
Okay, so there's a huge difference between what someone is literally saying and what they truly mean or intend, especially in therapy. Like, words have a conscious surface and this deep unconscious layer.
Precisely. The analyst aims for the advent of true speech and the subject's realization of his history in its relation to a future. It's about the subject finally speaking their truth, articulating their history in a way that opens up new ways of being. This true speech is contrasted with intermediate discourse. That's the everyday stuff, often filled with trickery and error. But even that bears witness to the existence of the kind of speech on which truth is based because it tries to pass itself off as true.
This seems to touch on something really profound about the unconscious itself, right? That it's always speaking, but often in disguise.
Yes, it reveals the very antinomy found in the meaning Freud gave to the notion of the unconscious. This speech, which constitutes the subject in its truth, is nevertheless forever forbidden to him, except in rare moments of his existence. Because of that intermediate discourse, social pressures, the ego's defenses, the unconscious is constantly speaking through us, but we're often blocked from fully recognizing or speaking that truth directly.
And this leads us straight into Freud's radical idea of the unconscious, which Lacan really develops, showing its deep connection to language and desire. 3.2, the unconscious as the other's discourse. Elements of the signifier.
Yes, Lacan gives us a radical redefinition here. He states very clearly, the unconscious is neither the primordial nor the instinctual, and what it knows of the elemental is no more than the elements of the signifier. This is a huge shift from thinking of the unconscious as just this dark pool of instincts. For Lacan, the unconscious is structured exactly like a language, a complex web of signifiers, always playing, always shifting. It is, he says, the discourse of the other.
So to interpret the unconscious, you need more than just psychology or biology. Sounds like you need to be like a linguist or a literary critic.
Absolutely. Lacan suggests that to interpret the unconscious as Freud did, one would have to be, as he was, an encyclopedia of the arts and muses. You need a deep grasp of symbolic play, allusions and quotations, puns and equivocations. The unconscious works through linguistic tricks like metaphor, metonymy, slips of the tongue, jokes, dreams. All that stuff requires a rich cultural and linguistic sensitivity to decode. It's a language of hidden links and substitutions.
And Freud himself provided amazing examples of this linguistic quality, didn't he? Like that famous case of forgetting a name.
Indeed. Lacan often points to Freud's analysis of forgetting the name Signorelli. Freud couldn't recall the painter's name, even though he remembered the fresco clearly. Why? The signifier disturbance. The word signor, Lord Master, was, for Freud, tied up with and repressed by thoughts about death and responsibility that were active in his unconscious at that moment. This extraordinary analysis, Lacan says, shows how the relation between the symptom and the signifier seems to emerge fully armed. The symptom of forgetting is a linguistic event, a slip of the signifier.
That's a really powerful illustration. Are there other examples he uses to show how these signifiers work at this hidden level?
Yes, another really compelling one comes from a case of fetishism. A patient needed a specific shine on the nose, glance after nose, for sexual satisfaction. Analysis showed this was a displacement from glance at the nose, blick after nose, in his forgotten childhood language, English in this case. The sound-alike words, the homophony, shows the constitutive role of the signifier in shaping desire and symptoms. The symptom isn't random, it's like a fossilized word, a linguistic pun holding a key to an unconscious memory.
He also talks about Freud's idea of negation, right? How when a patient says no to something, it actually confirms its presence in the unconscious.
That's right. Freud's essay Negation shows a concrete attitude at the origin of the explicit symbol of negation. This symbol lets us use the unconscious all the while maintaining the repression. The unconscious doesn't really have a no. It has presence or absence or maybe destruction. So when a patient says, you'll think I mean something insulting, but I really don't, the analyst hears that the repressed insulting idea is there precisely because it's being negated. The negation allows it to be spoken while keeping it repressed. So if the unconscious is structured like a language always at play, then understanding its mechanisms, its grammar, its puns is crucial for understanding ourselves. It really challenges the idea that our conscious experience is the whole story. Our deepest truths are often spoken, but in that other scene of language.
Which naturally leads us to the complex relationship between desire, demand, and how this fundamental sense of lack is absolutely central to human experience in Lacan's system. 3.3, desire, demand, and the foundational lack. Okay, so if the unconscious is language-like, what does that mean for our basic drives, our desires? Lacan makes some really important distinctions here that separate him from a lot of other psychological thinking.
He draws very clear lines between need, demand, and desire. Let's start with need. That's biological, right? For survival. It can be met by a specific object, food for hunger, water for thirst. Once you get it, the need is, for a while, satisfied.
Okay, simple enough. So what's demand? How's that different?
Demand is more complex. It's an articulated request, often spoken, but it's always asking for something beyond the need articulated in that demand. When a baby cries for milk, it's not just about food. It's also demand for the other's attention, presence, love. It seeks a response from the other, a recognition. Even if the milk comes, that underlying call for recognition for something more remains.
So demand always asks for more than just the thing itself.
Yeah.
And where does desire fit in then?
Desire starts to form in the margin in which demand rips away from need. This margin is the gap need may give rise to here because it has no universal satisfaction. This is called anxiety. No matter how much the other satisfies our demands, there's always a remainder, a fundamental dissatisfaction, an irreducible gap. That gap is desire. It's the yearning for something that no specific object can ever fully satisfy. What the other gives in response to demand but does not have, since he too lacks being, is what is called love, but it is also hate and ignorance. And paradoxically, the more need gets met on the surface, the more the subject remains deprived of those passions. Love, hate, ignorance, because the demand for something beyond satisfaction gets stifled by superficial fulfillment.
So desire isn't just wanting something specific. It's tied to this fundamental lack, something always just out of reach. It sounds like this restless, maybe unending pursuit.
Exactly. Freud recognized desire in dreams, not just tendencies. This desire is discourse, a discourse whose grammar Freud began to enunciate. The wishes in dreams, Lacan notes, have no optative inflection to alter the indicative in which they are formulated. They don't express wishes like, I hope or I might. They state them as facts within the unconscious grammar. They operate as something that is.
And the concept of castration is huge here, isn't it? Though maybe not in the literal way people first think.
Absolutely crucial. Castration is the altogether new mainspring Freud introduced into desire, giving desire's lack the meaning that remained enigmatic in Socrates' dialectic. This lack, this want to be, is key. It's not about a physical organ, it's a symbolic loss. It's the loss of a mythical wholeness or direct access to jouissance that happens when we enter the symbolic order, when we become speaking subjects. The phallus, in this context, is the signifier of the very loss the subject suffers due to the fragmentation brought on by the signifier. It represents the ratio of the other's desire. This phallocentrism, Lacan insists, is entirely conditioned by the intrusion of the signifier in man's psyche. The phallus symbolizes what's missing, what the other desires, and the fundamental loss that comes with being subjected to language.
How does this framework, especially symbolic castration, apply to female sexuality? That often gets tricky in these discussions.
Female sexuality is explored in relation to this symbolic dimension. Lacan dismisses the trivial opposition between clitoral jouissance and vaginal satisfaction. He emphasizes how castration presupposes the subjectivity of the other as the locus of its law. For a woman, he suggests, a man often serves as a relay so that a woman becomes this other to herself as she is to him. The other's desire, often linked to the desire for the phallus, which was desired by the mother in the Oedipal scenario, reemerges in the unconscious. It creates a complex dynamic of identification and lack, specific to how each sex is positioned within the symbolic order. It's about one's position relative to this symbolic lack and the signifier of desire, not just biology. This whole framework radically reframes human motivation. It shows our deepest urge, our identities aren't just biological. They're profoundly mediated by symbolic structures, by language, and by this fundamental sense of lack. It's a constant striving for something that, by definition, can never be fully attained, which keeps us tangled in the web of desire.
This is incredibly dense, definitely, but also really insightful. So, how do these complex theories actually translate into the practice of psychoanalysis and into how we understand truth itself in that clinical space?
Navigating truth, reality, and clinical practice.
Okay, so we've covered the symbolic order's power, the tricky nature of the ego, the linguistic unconscious. Now let's connect this back to the ground. How do these heavy theoretical ideas actually work in psychoanalytic practice? And especially, how does Lacan think about truth in that specific setting? 4.1, Truth and Knowledge, a shifting landscape.
This is a really crucial distinction Lacan makes, setting analysis apart. He says, truth and its specific value remains foreign to the order of science. Now, science can study truth, ally with it, make it an object, sure, but it can't identify truth as its ultimate goal. Science wants verifiable facts, objectivity, universal laws. Truth, in the analytic sense for Lacan, is, well, it's more elusive, more subjective, often disruptive.
So he's saying scientific facts aren't the whole picture when it comes to truth, especially the truth of a human subject.
Exactly. He even notes how modern physics and math, with their dizzying relativisms, have started shaking our usual lived criteria of truth. Things like certainty, self-evidence, non-contradiction, which we thought were solid ground. For Lacan, truth often represents the return of truth as such into the gap of a certain knowledge. It doesn't arrive neatly packaged. It often emerges as a symptom or a fiction, something that disrupts what we thought we knew, forcing a reevaluation.
And he uses Freud's famous door case to show this dynamic emergence of truth in the clinic, right?
Yes. Freud's door case becomes this example of a series of dialectical reversals. Truth is transmuted for the subject. It's not just Dora learning something intellectually, it fundamentally affects her comprehension of things and her very position as a subject. Her desires, her identifications, her whole subjective world shifts as truth emerges. The conception of the case history is identical to the progress of the subject, that is, to the reality of the treatment. Truth isn't just found, it's created, revealed in the back and forth of analysis. It's a truth that changes the person who speaks it. It's a really vital distinction for us to grasp. We often equate scientific fact with truth, but Lacan suggests truth has this more slippery, subjective, often disruptive quality, especially as it surfaces in analysis. It's not something you capture, it's something that speaks through you, often demanding a painful shift.
This unique take on truth must really shape how psychoanalysis approaches its work, making it very different from other therapies. 4.2 Psychoanalysis as a science of intersubjectivity and historicity.
It absolutely does. Lacan is firm. Psychoanalysis relies solely upon words. That's foundational. He warns that focusing too much on the nonverbal aspects of behavior reduces the subject to an object. And if you get too caught up in body language or gestures in a simplistic way, you risk missing the crucial symbolic dimension of speech. You turn the speaking subject into just an observable thing, which is the opposite of analysis. The words and the unconscious structures they reveal are primary.
It sounds like he wants to apply a kind of rigorous, almost scientific method to something inherently subjective, like human experience and meaning.
Exactly. He suggests tools like Boolean logic, set theory, can bring the structure of intersubjective time that psychoanalytic conjecture needs to ensure its own rigor to this science of human action. It's not about making humans into machines, but about formalizing the symbolic structures at play in relationships, like mapping a grammar. He also stresses the fundamental historicity of the events we are concerned with. This historicity suffices to conceive the possibility of a subjective reproduction of the past in the present. End quote. This puts psychoanalysis close to history, where the historian's subjectivity connects with the constitutive subjectivity of the primal historicization. Our past isn't just over, it's subjectively replayed, reenacted, relived in our present through the symbolic structures we inhabit.
So psychoanalysis isn't just another type of psychology, it's more fundamental, like a science of meaning itself.
He sees it as central to a vast conceptual movement, restructuring so many sciences that are improperly called social, changing or refinding the meaning of certain sections of mathematics, is reclassifying the body of sciences of intersubjectivity under the name human sciences. It elevates analysis beyond just therapy. It becomes a foundational human science that understands the subject through language, history, symbolic structures, not reducing them to biology or simple psychology. It's about understanding the subject as a speaking historical being.
Okay, with that foundation, let's look at the specific challenges and goals of the treatment itself. How does it differ from therapies focused on, say, just adapting to society? 4.3, the direction of treatment, beyond dyadic relations?
Given his views on the ego and the unconscious, Lacan sharply critiques what he saw as standard treatment, especially approaches that softened Freud's radical edge. He notes many analysts point to the end of analysis as identification with the analyst's ego as the goal, which he finds deeply problematic. He says that goal is most opposed to the truth that analysis must bring out. The aim isn't to create a mini-me of the analyst's supposedly healthy ego, or just adjust the patient to fit in better.
So what is the analyst's proper role in this delicate process, and what's the ideal outcome then?
The analyst must become permeable to the other's authentic speech. How? By making the mirages of his narcissism transparent. That self-awareness stops the analyst imposing their own ego ideals, their own stuff onto the patient. The real goal of analysis is the advent of true speech and the subject's realization of his history and its relation to a future. It's about helping the subject speak their own unique truth, fully own their history, and by doing that, open up new possibilities for being for their future.
And what about those core Freudian ideas like transference and resistance? How does Lacan view them? They're so central.
Transference, for Lacan, isn't just projecting old feelings onto the analyst. It's the enigmatic actualization of speech. It's the kind of reproduction that occurs in analysis, where old patterns, demands, unsaid things show up right there in the present relationship. The greater part of it must remain unnoticed by the subject initially, operating as this powerful, unspoken dynamic. Its Hegelian robustness, he says, lets it survive popularizing theory because it's fundamental to how the symbolic plays out in analysis. Resistance, likewise, isn't just the patient being difficult or oppositional. It includes the most accidental events of the subject's life that become obstacles to the analysis. It's essentially an ego phenomenon tied to the imaginary captures that constitute it from head to toe. It's the ego fighting to keep its illusions, its comfortable misrecognitions, safe from the emerging truth.
So the analyst has to be incredibly careful not to fall into traps that would shut down this process of finding true speech.
Absolutely. The analytic situation can only be crushed if one tries to inscribe it in a dyadic relation, just a simple two-person relationship. The analyst's job isn't to respond directly to the patient's demands, like giving comfort or advice. Instead, the analyst must sustain demand in order to allow the signifiers with which the latter's frustration is bound up to reappear. This avoids reducing the patient to needing emotional re-education and instead engages the deeper symbolic structures of their desire and frustration. The analyst acts as a point in a larger symbolic structure, not just another person.
This sounds like it demands a really specialized, rigorous training for analysts, way beyond standard psychology programs.
It does. Lacan stresses that analyst training must go beyond social psychological objectification. It needs to embrace linguistics, history, even mathematics. Why? To recover the meaning and motor force of the Freudian experience. Without that rigorous interdisciplinary grounding, analysis risks getting lost in simplistic models that just don't grasp the symbolic dimension of human suffering.
So the analyst isn't just a passive listener. They're an active, crucial participant in this dialectical process, helping the subject navigate the maze of their own language and history to find their truth, not just adapt.
Precisely. And this structural focus leads us to one of Lacan's most profound distinctions concerning severe mental illness, linking it directly to the symbolic order, to the very fabric of language.
The foreclosure of the name of the father.
You just mentioned a critical distinction Lacan makes between different kinds of mental suffering. Let's explore his understanding of psychosis, which he separates very clearly, structurally, from neurosis.
Yes. Lacan identifies the foreclosure of the name of the father in the place of the other, and the failure of the paternal metaphor as the defect that gives psychosis its essential condition, along with the structure that separates it from neurosis. This is a fundamental structural difference. The name of the father isn't just about the actual dad, it's a key signifier. It anchors the subject in the symbolic order, provides a reference point for law, identity, the structure of reality itself. In neurosis, the signifier is typically repressed, verdrängt. It's there, but hidden, influencing things from the unconscious. But in psychosis, it's foreclosed. It was never registered symbolically in the first place.
So it's not just about an absent father figure, but a symbolic absence. Like a crucial piece of grammar is missing from the foundation of someone's psychic reality.
Exactly. The lack is not the absence of the real father, but the lack of the signifier itself, the name of the father, as a foundational principle. This means the psychotic subject isn't adequately anchored in the symbolic order, the shared world of language and law. This has huge consequences for their relationship to reality, their sense of self. Without that anchor, the symbolic system that structures reality for the neurotic is fundamentally unstable, maybe even absent for the psychotic.
And he uses that incredibly detailed case of Daniel Paul Schreber to illustrate this breakdown, right? The German judge who wrote that memoir of his psychosis, he becomes like a living example for Lacan's theory.
Lacan absolutely uses Schreber's elaborate delusional autobiography to show the effects of this foreclosure. Schreber's ideas like God having a hyperspace or signifying transmissions being conducted along filaments into his head, they point to this profound breakdown in the symbolic. His reality is flooded with raw signifiers, words, and concepts that aren't anchored by that paternal metaphor. The shared fabric of meaning has disintegrated, leaving him to build his own, often terrifying, reality.
What about those weird miracled birds and talking birds Schreber described? Freud kind of dismissed them as silly geese.
Right. Those miracled birds, talking birds, forecourts of heaven. Freud saw them as silly geese, but Lacan sees them as representing Schreber's surprise at the similarity of vocables and the purely homophonic equivalences. It highlights the raw, unbound nature of the signifier in psychosis. Meanings aren't fixed. They float freely, connecting based on sound rather than stable symbolic links. It's like language itself has come unglued, and the psychotic subject is lost in this sea of unattached words and sounds. Schreber struggled to use words against the dismayingly silly trap set by his lord, his effort to stand his ground in the name of the order of things, will toward none. Lacan sees this as a unique kind of victory. It's a desperate attempt by someone whose symbolic world has collapsed to reconstruct some order, however strange, from the fragments of language.
It sounds like Lacan was also critical of how other analytic approaches try to treat psychosis, maybe because they missed this fundamental structural difference.
Very much so. Lacan actually praises the insight of McAlpine, who observed that psychoanalysts claim to be able to cure psychosis in all cases in which psychosis is not involved. It highlights how inadequate approaches are if they ignore the specific structure of psychosis. He quotes the character Midas saying, "It is clear that psychoanalysis is possible only with the subject for whom there is another." End quote. In psychosis, that fundamental relationship to the other, mediated by the name of the father, is precisely what's missing or broken. So standard analytic techniques just won't work in the same way without acknowledging that structural difference.
So instead of seeing psychosis as just a biological or psychological deficit, Lacan shows it as this specific structural breakdown in how the subject is ordered by symbols. It's tied intimately to language and the anchors that define reality for most people.
Precisely. This structural view offers a radically different way to think about it. It emphasizes the critical role of language and the signifier in how psychosis develops and how one might approach it, rather than just medicating or trying to correct symptoms without getting at the underlying symbolic architecture. Outro.
Wow. Okay. That was a truly deep dive into Lacan's Écrits. We've covered a lot how the symbolic order shapes us, the slippery nature of the ego, the unconscious structured like a language, that complex dance of desire and demand. It's dense stuff, often counterintuitive, but the insights are, wow, they're pretty powerful.
Yeah, the core takeaway, I think, is that Lacan forces us to accept we are fundamentally subjects of language. Our reality, who we think we are, our deepest desires, they're all woven from these threads of the signifier. This huge tapestry that existed before us and constantly shapes us. It really pushes us beyond simple psychological explanations. To embrace the profound, often paradoxical insights that come when we pay close attention to speech, to the symbolic order, it's about seeing that hidden grammar shaping our lives.
What really stands out for me is that Lacan isn't just giving us a theory, it's a whole different way of thinking about being human, about being a subject caught in this web of meaning and language. It's a potent reminder that sometimes the most familiar things, our sense of self, the words we use every single day, hold the deepest, most surprising, sometimes unsettling truths about who we really are. It's like a journey into the architecture of our own minds. So for you, our listener, here's maybe a final thought to take away and mull over. If our very being is caught in the symbolic order, like Lacan says, and the unconscious speaks through these elements of the signifier, what new ways might that open up for understanding yourself, for understanding your deepest motivations, the unspoken stories that really define your history, maybe beyond what your conscious mind tells you? Something to ponder until our next deep dive.